Okay, so as I've been looking at this render on top of the six-pack coming out the ground, I feel like this reflection strength isn't really there enough, at least for the kind of glass that I like to see in bottles. So what I want to do is just one last little tweak. I just want to increase the amount of reflection that this glass material has, and I'll show you how to do that real quick. We come back in this scene. I'm going to turn on the interactive render region on just this bottle, and I'm going to open up this glass material, and if I mess with the reflection strength and the specular strength, let's see if that changes anything. Bring this in like this. Just get that one reflective strip. Okay, so there it is. So I'm going to turn the specular strength up 10%. Didn't really do it. And that's because it's actually the layer Fresnel that we set earlier for this glass is actually dictating how much reflection is going on. So if we have the layer Fresnel right now, it's set to glass, which is what we want, and it has its own IOR and everything. Now if I just turn this off, I can show you what it actually does to this bottle. You can see how the material example changes too. So now it becomes chrome basically, which is also not what we want. That's too shiny. That's way too much. So if you turn this back on, oops. If we turn this back on to dielectric with the glass preset, it comes back to this, which still isn't, now it's too much, at least as far as it cuts the reflection down too much, and changing these settings won't change it. So what we can do is just turn the strength down, and I'm going to turn it down to, just to see, I'm going to turn it to 75%. Let's see what that does. I don't know. I think that's too much right there, especially. So I'll go up to 85%. I'm kind of liking that. I'm going to expand this to be both bottles. That's really close, but I think it's still too much. So I'm going to try, I think, either 90% or 95%. So I'm going to try 90. See where that takes us. That's good. That's still a little bit, just barely too much though. I'm going to just do like 93%. Very close. Okay, so here they are side by side. I do think it has gotten a lot better. It's not a ton. There's not a ton more reflection going on, but I think there is just enough there to just give it some more realism. I felt like that was just a little bit too dark. Not enough reflection. So that's great. That was the last thing I really wanted to do. I'm going to render this whole scene real quick, just one frame, to see how it all looks, and then we can start working on output. I'm liking that. I like how that looks. Now we can start setting the output settings, and I can show you what an object buffer is and how to use that in Photoshop to make it so we can change this background color in Photoshop without having to re-render everything. And to do that, first thing I want to do is go to the render settings, check output. This is fine for the type of render we want to do, but this frame size would be something that you'd want to mess with and make sure you knew beforehand what you wanted. There are a lot of presets for different frame sizes. There's, these are for screens. This is for the web. Film and video, I always like to do HDTV 1080, 24 frames per second. That's what I've gotten used to for rendering. But, you can do that, or you can type in your own. I think the important thing is, unless you really know that you need it to stay at this resolution for the pixels per square inch, because that will add a ton of render time and not a lot of noticeable difference to the image. So anyway, just worry about that. And I'm going to turn this save on. I'm going to set an output path, and I'm going to save it as a PNG just because I like PNGs. And I'm going to save it with 18 or 16 bits per channel. PNGs are nice and nice small size, but they still retain a lot of information for the image. I think they're really nice. So if you go to the button right here for the file, this is where you can set an output path. We go into section 6, and I like to make a folder called renders, and just for fun to do a date too, in case there are multiple renders across different days. And do that. I'm going to turn this on for right now, but we're going to come back to it. Anti-aliasing, we changed it earlier to Mitchell's, very nice. Physical is set like this. Now that we're done with messing around and tweaking, I'm going to turn this to medium. I'm going to leave this in the same preset. And of course, I'm going to actually move this down like I said I was going to. Perfect. So what we're going to do, I need to select this background right here. And to set up a object buffer is what it's called, there needs to be a tag applied to this object. So if I right click and go to Cinema 4D tags, there's a tag right here called Compositing. A compositing tag can do a lot of really cool stuff. One of them is in this tab right here, an object buffer. And you have these checkboxes, and you have up to 12 different object buffers basically that can be rendered out in one scene. So if I just check this checkbox called Enable, it highlights this called Buffer, and it's number 1. And that's fine to see right now. It'll make a lot more sense once we get a rendered image. But one more thing that needs to happen is go back to render settings and go to multipass right here, and in this button there's an object buffer setting. So if I set that, by default it goes to number 1, group ID 1, which is perfect because that's the object buffer that we enabled. Now if I did this, say we had multiple object buffers in a scene, and I wanted this one to be the 5th object buffer that gets rendered out, I'd have to go up here and change the group ID to 5 so that this would render out. And if we did have multiple object buffers, and you can do this on one object too, you can have multiple object buffers render out, you'd have to go back to multipass and set new object buffers for each one that you want rendered out. So you have that. And you can also double click this and rename it. So I'm going to rename this background. I'm going to keep this at number 5 just because. But what I want to do also is I'm going to make an object buffer that just renders out the bottle caps. So we can change those colors too if we wanted. Just to show you what is possible. So I go to object buffer right here and do group ID is set to 3. I'm going to rename this bottle caps. So now I'm going to go in here, right click this, and I go down here. I can unfold all of these that I've selected so I can see all of them unfolded. And I'm going to right click the first bottle cap and do a compositing tag and enable the object buffer number 3 on that tag. Now what's cool is I can now just hold down command and click and drag this tag onto the objects that I want to be rendered with that object buffer. I'll do that, and there's a couple more. Cool, that's all of them. Now we have 2 multi-pass layers that will be rendered out as separate images along with the main image, the regular image. So now you have 2 output paths that need to be set. One for the rendered image and then one for the multi-pass images. And by default, the format's set to Photoshop, and instead of rendering out individual files for each multi-pass file that you've saved, you can have it render out into a Photoshop file with layers inside that file of each multi-pass, which is really nice. So we're going to do it that way. Go in here, do the same thing in that same folder, and I like to do this, even though it writes its own suffix. MP for multi-pass. So now you have these 2 output paths set, and everything's checked. So here we go. This looks really nice, and I think the reflections, I think they look perfect. And one way to tell how your multi-pass images have rendered out is if you go into the layer tab right here in the picture viewer. You can see the layers for the scene that have been rendered out, and you can't select them until you go from image to single pass. Now when I select this, you can see it did exactly what I wanted. It's a pure black and white image of the selection that I made of the bottle caps and the selection that I made of the background. It's going to be really helpful in Photoshop or After Effects or Nuke to composite different things and be able to control the image after it's been rendered without having to go back into Cinema to render. So it's super powerful. I'm going to show you how to do that real quick. So let's go into Photoshop, and I'm just going to open up the rendered images right here. Okay, great. This will be black because the way it does this in Photoshop, the passes get put into the channels section of the Photoshop file, which is a little bit annoying because you can see them, but you can't do anything with them like you would in After Effects. What you can do with these, now that they're in the channels path, is you can send these actually to a different file. So because the image file came out in its own file and the multi-pass images came out in their own files, I want to be able to move this layer, this channel, onto the rendered image file. And I don't want to do it just like this either. I'm going to just grab it and drag it. Because then you can't tell if you place it exactly and all that kind of stuff. It messes up. So that's not what you want. What you can do in Photoshop is if you hold down Command and click on this layer, you'll see a selection gets made, which is really nice. So it has a selection. It selects the image inside this object buffer. If I go to layers, if I go back to RGB, make it black, you can see how this is now a selection. It's very nice. So if I go to layers, and I just open this to be a layer, and I'm going to add a new layer, transparent, and then I'm just going to click the layer mask button down here. And now what I have, you can see, I have this same object buffer render, but as a layer mask. And so I'm just going to call this object buffer 5 for the name of this multipass render. And that's really cool. So I have a transparent layer with an object mask of exactly the background selection we made. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to do it one more time for the other selection right here. So if I hold down Command and click that, I'll get another selection. I'll go back to layers, go back to RGB right here, layers. So here's my selection of the bottle caps. Make a new layer and hit the object mask button. And now I've got an object mask selection of the bottle caps. I'm just going to call this bottle caps. Okay, so great. We have 2 layers with exact layer masks set, which is going to be great. It's exactly what we want. We want a layer mask of all of these object buffer renders. So the best thing now to do is we have to select this layer, go to layer, and go up here to duplicate layer. You can just call this bottle caps mask. And you can, in this duplicate layer dialog box, you can set the destination of where this layer is going to go, which means it can go between different files. And so as long as your final render is open in Photoshop, you can select that as your destination document. So I'm going to select that as a destination document and hit OK. So now when I go to the final render, I have a layer now of this layer mask of the bottle caps, which is great. It'll be useful in a second. So do the same thing. We'll duplicate this layer. I'm just going to call this background mask now. Select that layer, duplicate layer. I'm going to name this correctly. Oops. Set the destination as the final render image. Hit OK. And awesome. Now they're both in this image. And we don't really need this anymore. I'm just going to close this and not save it. Well, actually, I will save it so we can come back to these layers if we need them. Okay, great. I'm going to save this as a Photoshop file now. So now all we have to do to change this background color is to go down here to the adjustment layers, and we can do a hue saturation adjustment layer. And now if I just hold down Alt while I drag this mask, it gets copied onto the hue and saturation adjustment layer. And there we go. Now it's got masked out. Now we can change the hue like that. Just like that. So that gives you enough power to, do some compositing post-production work inside Photoshop, and gives you some flexibility to change your image once it's already been rendered without having to go back into Cinema and re-render in case you have like some kind of color change you want to do. Same thing with the bottle caps, and really anything that you want to select inside Cinema. You could apply a compositing tag to it and have it render out as its own object buffer, and it can be brought into Photoshop, and it gives you that control in post, as we say. It's very useful. There are a lot of multi-passes. There are multi-pass renders for shadows and lighting and reflections and everything. And all those things can be rendered out as separate images that can be then recomposited back together in Photoshop and controlled that way too. That's an art in itself, I think. But I just wanted to show you the power of multi-pass object buffer renders in your workflow. And we now have a completed image in Photoshop with flexibility and a lot of bit depth. We have 16 bits to mess with. And that concludes the tutorial. I hope that it helped out. Hope it got you over the intimidation hump. And I look forward to your feedback. I'll be making some more tutorials this year, so stay tuned. Thank you.